the first part I just started early so we can find where we want to start it.
Got it.
No. Then hit share my screen. Yep. Hold on. And hit install. Not yet. So it should now be sharing the screen, etc. But we're still on mute. No one can hear us yet. So until you start the broadcast, no one can see anything.
Yeah.
So always hit those not now until we're actually ready to start, which will be, we'll do at 11. Starting point.
Yeah, we'll wind up with 40.
So what could make the NI sensitivity go down, but the monetary value not?
Lunch.
Because I don't understand why.
Kind of above my head too, but it happened last time.
So for questions, any ones that we get in, I'll write down and let you know.
I won't see them. Oh, you'll see them. Okay.
That's why I'll actually write them down.
Okay. And is that part of your opening comments?
Yeah.
You're going to tell people how to.
Yeah.
Okay. I doubt we'll get many, but who knows? I hope we do.
Hey, this is Pat.
Hey, Pat. This is Scott.
Can you guys?
Your bot. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. You can hear me.
Yeah, Al. Can you hear us?
Yep, I'm hearing everything.
Okay. So,
Okay.
Pat, you are live, and Al's live.
I may not have anything to say, but I thought I'd go ahead and, in case something jumps to mind, I might offer something. But I hadn't planned on anything. I have nothing planned. But if
we do appreciate that you, Pat, we do appreciate that you could fit this in between your vacations. You know that.
Yeah, I understand. I can't believe to begin to tell you how much work people are sending me these last couple of days. I'm getting all kinds of ALMs and ERMs to look at, but that's fine. That's the price I have to pay.
All right, we're going to go live in a minute
fine.
or so.
All right, I got to get to the screen here. Let me see.
So.
Who's controlling the screen?
Scott is here.
I got the remote. So
Okay.
the way we'll do it is I'm going to have certain slides I'm going to cover. Then I'm going to turn it over to Al. He's going to have slides to cover.
Okay.
If you have anything, Pat, obviously chime in, and Al and I are also going to chime in on each other's presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Bob.
Here, just make sure you can hear everyone correctly.
Bob, what I'd like you to do is open up and just say we're going to start in another minute or so.
Yeah.
Okay. So, guys, we're going live now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another FinPro webinar. We're going to get started here in a couple minutes, just waiting for a couple more people to give them the chance to get on. So in a couple minutes, we will get started. All right, we're all going to get started now. Again, welcome to another FinPro webinar. This webinar today is part of the compliance series. Specifically, it's going to be on preparing for regulation or regulatory examinations. It's going to be led today by Scott Polikoff and Al Clark. We may also be hearing from Pat Rohan. In a second, I'll turn it over to Scott, and he'll introduce each of them and give you an overview of what we'll be going through. I want to go through a couple administrative items beforehand. Our next webinar is on July 6th. It's our Economic and Interest Rate Outlook webinar for quarter 3. So if you haven't signed up for that already, please do on our online store. CPE credits are available today. If you're interested in the CPE credits, I know a lot of you have been through this process before, just enter your name and the phrase pre-exam 101 into the question box, and we'll make sure that we get you those CPE credits. The password for access to the recording of this webinar and the presentation itself is proactive with a capital P, 15 exclamation point. We'll go over this again at the end of the webinar, but the webinar or the copy of the presentation is also available in the handout section of the webinar on the right, so you can download from there as well. So with that, I want to turn it over to Scott Polikoff, and he'll jump right into it.
Explain questions.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody. I'm pleased with the turnout that we have for an important topic about preparing for the regulatory exam. Looks like we got folks from across the country. We're going to try to keep this presentation to 60 minutes. And I also wanted to let you know that probably the last 5 minutes or so of this presentation, we're going to ask Steve Musso and Scott Martirana to join us, and they're going to talk a little bit about the Fed's decision yesterday to increase the short-term rate environment and some things that we should be thinking of. Obviously, it's that topic's beyond the topic for this webinar, but it is so recent we wanted to take the advantage with a couple hundred folks on the webinar to share some thoughts on that issue. As you can see on this cover slide, joining me is Al Clark. This is Scott Polikoff, for those of you who have not had the pleasure to meet. I'm co-chair of the board of FinPro. I've been here about 6 years, and I work with the regulatory team. Joining me on this webinar is Al Clark. Al is part of the regulatory team. He spent 31 years with the FDIC and was responsible in his last couple of years for all the examinations in the state of Michigan. The Michigan bankers on the line, I'm sure, know Al well. Al's going to co-present with me. We've also asked Pat Rowan to join this. Pat, many of you know, especially up in the New England states. Pat had a 32-year career with the FDIC. He's been with FinPro for a dozen years, well-known and obviously an expert on many regulatory issues. So Pat's going to be somewhat of our color commentator. I shared with you on this cover slide both my email address and Al Clark's email address. So if you don't have an opportunity to ask a question during this presentation, or if we say something that, as you reflect, causes any concerns for you, please feel free to email either Al or me. We're going to bifurcate this webinar into two distinct parts. One is an opportunity for me to share with all of you the Regulatory Feedback Initiative findings. So we're kind of starting at the end, and we're going to work our way back. So the Regulatory Feedback Initiative is going to go over some of the results that we have seen in this calendar year from examinations. So we're going to talk about the findings, and then I'm going to ask Al Clark to spend a good 30 minutes talking about actual action items that we should all consider in preparing for our next exam. The Regulatory Feedback Initiative is something that you may be familiar with. It actually starts with the Coalition of Bankers Associations. Going back to 2011, this group put together a survey process with the hope that all banks, regardless of charter, would provide an anonymous survey response addressing a number of questions that pertain to the examination. We're going to walk through some of them. I think for those of you who are not familiar with this concept, I would ask you, when you have an opportunity, to go to the website. Their website is All Bankers, that's ALLBANKERS.org, All Bankers, and it will further introduce you to this Regulatory Feedback Initiative. There's a couple things within this RFI process that I just want to highlight and bring to your attention. The survey is an electronic survey, and it's absolutely confidential. Because it's a confidential survey, the way the process works is you first need to reach out to your banking association and say, we've just had our examination or we've just had our visitation. Please give us our unique password so that we can then access the anonymous survey with this nondescript password, which will give us access to the survey, and then we can complete the survey process. So it's pretty easy. The only other important note when you complete the survey is y'all are very busy people and you get interrupted a lot. The survey, since it's anonymous and since it's predicated on a unique password for you, it's a one-time password. You cannot get in and out of the survey. Once you're in and exit, you need another unique password to start all over again. So please just block out the 15 or 20 minutes necessary to complete this survey. So what are some of the interesting findings that we have from this survey? And first, let's start with between January 1st of 2017 and June 6th of 2017, there were 233 banks that responded or provided input to the survey. So it's a decent number. And each slide, we show you what the response rate was. So in this particular slide, we had 184 responses. I should also tell you when I use the term we, FinPro is working closely with this coalition. And actually, the coalition came to us and wanted to leverage the advanced analytics team that resides at FinPro to better craft unique reports for individual banks. And that's what the beauty of this is banks provide the survey responses, and then before your next exam, you can actually request a comprehensive report that tells you everything that bankers have been observing from examinations recently so you can get prepared for your next exam. So in this case, we see 9% of the respondents, we had 184 banks respond over this period of time to answer this specific question. 9% of them, or 17, said that they had a decline in their CAMELS rating. 71% said it stayed the same, and 20% had an improvement. But I think what's important in this survey is it's not just numerical responses, but bankers have the opportunity to actually write comments. And we're going to focus on some of these comments. So in this case, for those that had a CAMELS decline, what they said was there was a whole lot of emphasis placed on BSA for community banks. And that doesn't surprise either Pat or Al or I. More and more as we interact with the regulatory community and the examiners, we know there's a continuing emphasis on BSA. You see the second bullet on this page, management's been criticized a lot for strategic plans. Again, this is an area that doesn't surprise us. At one point last year, the OCC ranked strategic risk as its #1 risk. Strategic risk is synonymous with execution risk, i.e., the ability to actually execute on the strategic plan. And I think frequently what you hear from examiners, and certainly for those of you on the line who are clients of FinPro, we are adamant as we work through strategic plans with the management team and the board that we have the proper infrastructure in place to actually execute on the strategic plans, generally 3-year strategic plans. I found the third bullet very interesting, and it's in quotes.
Scott,
so we wanted to get it.
Scott,
Yeah,
Scott, can I say something on this part here? The other thing this is Pat Rowan, by the way. The other thing I thought I'd just emphasize on the strategic plans is they're not only looking at the strategic plans, but they're looking at how those plans get created. And I think the message that's coming through is they expect boards of directors to be involved in that process. And if it's just a plan that management creates and takes it into the board to be rubber stamped, there's likely to be criticism. So there's an expectation that directors have involvement in putting together the strategic plan and that they know what's in the strategic plan. So it's not just the plan itself, but also the process and how that plan is created.
Great point, Pat. Absolutely. Good point. The third bullet in quotes, clearly a new message from the Fed is to slow down on growth, increase capital levels, and avoid commercial real estate. And for our clients that happen to be state member clients, we have seen that exact message. The Federal Reserve is very, very bearish on commercial real estate. And quite frankly, in our work with our clients, we're almost seeing the Federal Reserve mandate the 300% as a line in the sand and are uncomfortable with any banks that have in excess of 300%, regardless of the strong risk management practices that the bank has deployed. And then the last bullet is that many bankers are having to push examiners for communication during examinations. And Al Clark's going to talk about this later, but I'm also going to introduce a slide that is very troubling to all of us, and that is there is a group of very young, inexperienced examiners who are functioning as examiners in charge, and we're seeing that the less experienced examiners in charge tend to communicate much less than the more seasoned, experienced examiners in charge. And in fact, this is the next slide. So I very much first focus on the point that we had a 100% response rate to this question: how many years has the EIC been supervising bank examinations? And let's look at some of these numbers. 27% report that the EICs have been doing this for less than 3 years, and another 17% report between 3 to 5 years. So we have 44% of the EICs having done this less than 5 years. And of course, that's going to be a very troubling situation for many of you, because it's going to connotate either A, the EICs are younger, or B, they're less experienced, or a combination thereof. And to me, what's problematic is the training for some of these examiners in charge has only been accomplished in distressed economic environments, and I'm not yet convinced that some of these folks, especially the folks who have been doing this for less than 5 years, I'm not convinced that they have the confidence to properly examine a bank in a stronger economic cycle. I.e., it takes examiner confidence to see that the glass is half full. Less confident, less experienced examiners always see the glass is half empty. Al's going to talk about this later in the presentation, but part and parcel to this is the concern that we always should have if we have a team that is a training team examining our bank, or the concern that we should always have if we have an out-of-territory team examining our bank. And again, Al will address some of those issues. There's no doubt, and again, another question that got 100% response, there's no doubt that the first day letter all of you received asked for an incredible amount of documentation to be provided to the examiners before they come on site. What this slide tells me, where 43% of the respondents to this question answered yes, i.e. that examiners are asking questions that they would have had the answers to if they would have read all the provided material, tells me that we're being asked for a lot of information and that examiners are not always reading the information or providing the information to their examination team. And I'm just going to ask Al Clark quickly, is this something you're going to discuss later on with the process, or is this something you want to comment on now?
I could comment on it now, Scott. I think to a degree this has always been an issue, but it's become more of an issue since, at least from the FDIC and the state concept and the Fed, they've gone completely electronic, paperless, and you're depending on the software and how the questionnaire was sent and how the information is collated and distributed to the crew. So rather than in the old days, like me, would just go to the work paper box and pull a piece of paper that was printed once and look at it and know it, sometimes it's not as easy to find electronic transfers, and that may be a cause for problems because they've just recently adopted a comprehensive program for work papers within the last year or so, and I'm sure some of them are still having trouble with some of the items provided electronically.
Thanks, Al. Appreciate that. So I want to continue. there were a couple questions. Here's a question: was an IT exam involved in the process? And we have 77% of the respondents saying yes, and that doesn't surprise us. Normally, an IT exam is going to be part of a safety and soundness exam. Sometimes the IT specialist is not available, so the exams get a little out of sync. But this is, I think, the important point. Now, the response rate, it was relatively low, and I think we need to accept that. But the points of focus, clearly from an IT exam perspective, were vendor management and business continuity. So it's nice to see where the focus has been, also user access. But let's look at what how some of the bankers commented. Under business continuity, there was a desire of the examiners to see more documentation around testing of the continuity plan, including recovery point objectives. Under vendor management, the examiners wanted to see more financial statements for these key IT vendors. Some experience. This next bullet is troubling, but somewhat consistent throughout all of the discussions. There's inconsistencies. You know, this bullet is saying, depending on the quality of the IT examiners conducting the exam, could very much impact the complexity of the exam, and that's always going to be a challenge. Then this fourth bullet, which talks about an FDIC document, it's actually talking about FIL Financial Institution Letter. It's FIL 43-2016. It was issued June 30th of 2016. It's the Information Technology Risk Examination Program. It's something that I would say for all of the board members and all the senior management team on the room, I would hope that you would ask your IT folks to brief you on this FIL if you're not familiar with it. This particular FIL captures a couple different things. It's intended to provide instructions on an enhanced risk-based approach for conducting IT exams. It also mentions the importance of cybersecurity preparedness and lays out some expectations in that area. And it further streamlines the IT profile, so to speak, that financial institutions will complete in advance of the examination. That profile is what replaces what used to be called the IT officer's questionnaire. So if I'm offering you this FIL 43-26, and if you're not familiar with it, please ask your IT folks to comment on it. Again, we're going to move to management. The response rate was low at 13%, but the other category, you know, the comments that we want to focus on, BSA, again, you heard this earlier, BSA programs were frequently criticized. Management needs to ensure that they have qualified individuals. There needs to be more oversight of the board. I'm going to go back to, you know, the term oversight of the board is a little unique, but I think it goes back to what Pat Rowan said earlier when he was talking about the strategic plan. The board needs to do the right thing, and whether it's approving the strategic plan, whether it's approving policies and procedures, whether it's an effective audit committee, an effective nomination committee. I think Pat's point was a really solid point, that the examiners are looking at the work that the board is doing, and they're looking at the work that the management team's doing. And then succession planning is always going to be critical, and an updated strategic plan is always going to be critical. Liquidity, this particular tide, again, the response rate's very low. All I wanted to point out to you on this slide is that there is, in the regulators' minds, this issue of a liquidity bubble. The regulators are looking at each of your institutions when they conduct an examination, and they're looking at whether you're using listing service, broker deposits, or whether you're running any specials. And the focus the examiners have right now is whether any of those specials or listing service are more than 75 basis points above the national rate. And just so you understand how the examiners are approaching this, they're looking at what your stress tests are. And when you show a stress test that results in a capital ratio less than well capitalized, the examiners then very naturally are going to look to your contingency funding plan and whether you are offering any rates, listing service, brokered, or any of your specials that exceed 75 basis points over the national average. And remember, If you're doing that for your savings accounts or your money market accounts, national rate for savings is 0.06. National rate for money markets 0.07. So if you're offering specials of 110 for savings or money market, you're going to be above that 75 basis point trigger, and you're going to probably get a lot of regulatory attention at the exam. I don't want to focus on sensitivity now. It's clearly going to be a hot issue for the examiners, especially in a rising rate environment. And like I said, Steve Musso and Scott Martirana are going to talk about that a little bit. My last slide before I turn it over to Al Clark are some of the hot topics. And just quickly, cybersecurity is always going to be a hot topic. We mentioned it a little earlier. It's always going to get a lot of regulatory attention. Fair lending and CRA, we talked about this at one of the webinars recently with regulatory hot issues. The whole CRA issue is changing under some DOJ action recently, and absolutely positively for those folks on the room that are state member banks and are working with the Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve's approach to CRA and assessment areas is changing significantly and can really impact in a negative way your CRA exam. So please reach out to us and we're happy to talk about it further. The Dodd-Frank Act and the regulatory relief initiatives, I'll give a shout out to Sean Dillon, who recently introduced to me the term Kentucky windage. Kentucky windage is this notion for those hunters and military folks on the line. If you got a long range shot, you got to somehow take into account which way the wind's blowing. When it comes to regulatory relief and what's happening with Dodd-Frank, I would say that term applies here. We have to figure out which way the wind's blowing. It's clearly blowing in the sense of relief, but this is an unpredictable Congress. We don't know what's going to happen. Many of you, I hope, have seen the recent publication by the Treasury Department on how it wants to change the financial system for banks and credit unions. It just came out a couple days ago. It's a great read for, if you're interested in that kind of stuff. It's a great read. I found it interesting, and we'll probably do a webinar on it as we move forward. And then the last bullet on here is CECL. CECL is still unpredictable. All I want to say with CECL is there's a lot of consulting firms out there that are trying to sell models to address CECL. Please do not succumb to their scare tactics. There's plenty of time to implement CECL. CECL can be implemented in many reasonable ways. There is no need to go out and buy specific models to drive CECL analysis. And for many of the folks on the line who are already FinPro clients, we're going to be able to help you with that process anyway. But regardless, don't succumb to the scare tactics. So with that, before I turn it over to Al, Al, is there anything that you wanted to add to any of my comments? And then I'll ask Pat Rowan the same thing. But first, Al, anything you wanted to add?
About the only thing that addresses that initiative, communication with the bankers, is any FDIC bank knows under the cover of the report when they get it back, there's a banker survey that the FDIC has been using for years, trying to gauge similar information. How did the exam go? Did the team know what was going on? Was it organized? It used to be that was tracked by field office, by supervisor, and folks were graded on it. I don't know that the bankers feel that it's truly anonymous, but it is. As a former supervisor, we would get all these graphs, and if you did 20 exams that quarter, you had no idea who was answering what. The only thing you were sure is when you did a problem bank, your grade was going to go down. So I just wanted to add that there is other supervisory methods. I don't know if the FDIC is placing as much focus on the results as they used to.
Thanks, Al. Pat, anything you want to add before we move over to Al's section?
Just sort of a general comment. I think it ties a couple things in, Scott. You talked about a lot of new EICs and then some of the hot button areas, liquidity and sensitivity. We are seeing clients that are getting requests from usually newer examiners about putting things in policies that at least I've never seen in policies before, or requests to put these things in a policy, and there's no real literature out there that says it. So I guess the message I would be to the folks on the phone, if you get sort of what you think is a bizarre request to put something in a policy, you know, if you're one of our clients, let us know so we can take a look at it and see if it makes sense, or if this is just a younger EIC sort of going a little bit off the tracks as far as what they expect in a policy, because this seems to be coming up on a more recurring basis, just requests from examiners for banks to put things in policies that there's no literature or nothing the agencies have ever issued addressing those particular issues as far as they should be in policies. So if you see something like that, let us know and we can kind of take a look at it and see if it's something we might want to wade in on and pursue with the regulators, or at least give you some advice on how to pursue some of those things.
Thanks, Pat. Okay, Al, I'm going to ask you to walk us through, and you have probably a good 20, 25 minutes worth of material to cover, so it's all yours.
Thanks, Scott, and good morning. Some of the things that I'm going to say are probably old hat to many, but they might be news to some, and I'm going to approach it primarily from the risk management exam point of view. That's my experience. As far as contacts and exams, typically with the FDIC, if you have a risk management exam, concurrently you're going to have a BSA part of that exam, an IT part of that exam, and if you have a trust department, that will be part of that exam. But I'm going to approach it basically from the risk management point of view. When Scott, Pat, and I were examining banks, just after they got rid of the stone tablets and went to the typewriter, probably the most planning that went into an exam is you got a call from your supervisor Thursday night saying, next week you're starting a bank in, who knows, Brill, Wisconsin. So the entire planning process was you got to go back to the office early, pull the work papers in the exam, and you start an exam Monday morning. And on that Monday morning, you showed up with the crew, and that was the first time the banker knew he was going to be examined. I do miss the looks on the face of bankers when that happens. Fortunately, for exam efficiency and for banker awareness, typically you're going to get a 30-day advance notice. That varies whether you're going to get a call in a letter or just a letter. And typically the letter is going to introduce who the examiner in charge is, who should be the point of contact for the pre-exam activities. Sometimes that's cut short when the schedule gets disrupted, and it might be shorter than they're allowed, but you should be contacted and given a reason why there's a sudden exam, because it's, as you all know, it's disruptive to your normal operations. When the regulator contacts you, there is sometimes letters you have to sign and send your auditor that gives the regulator access to the work papers, and the examiners will go out and do a CPA work paper review. That's not mandatory at every exam, and it typically varies depending on the condition of the bank. What's more important is once you know you're going to be examined and you know the date, is to get your bank ready for the exam. The old adage is you can only make a good first impression once. If you are organized, you return everything they ask for, and everybody in the bank is ready for an exam, that generally gives a favorable impression to an exam crew. So one of the first things you want to do is get your department heads together and go, we're having an exam, here's the date, get our ducks in a row for this exam. Typically the FDIC will ask, do any board members want to attend any of the meetings? That's actually recorded in the confidential section, and you will get some brownie points if directors show interest during the exam. They don't have to be there for everything, but exit meetings or loan discussions, if you have a director that's very interested and can provide some input, it makes it look like the board is very interested in the bank. One of the things the examiners are going to do at every exam is they're going to look at the last exam, management's commitments to anything that was found in the exam, and was it actually corrected. Typically, the banker's already sent in response to the prior exam, everything's fine. Well, if the examiners come in and find, no, not everything is fine and things weren't addressed, that's a definite bad mark on management. You don't want too many of those. Another thing that's important is once you know the exam date, if your head of lending or head of operations or IT department head has got vacation planned, let the EIC of that exam know right away so he or she can move around the exam functions to plan for that vacation. Also, and this is a little touchy, it's touchy from the regulator side because some examiners you might have found are a little more prickly to deal with. Some bankers don't deal with regulators very well. You got to do a little
self-evaluation of your banking staff and determine if you want to counsel some of your executives on how to act, or maybe have someone else with them when they're interacting with the examiners to put a hand on a knee or at least wave them off if they're getting a little worked up. You know who has had bad experiences with examiners or exams in your bank, and that's something you should be aware of. Next slide.
Al, before you go far, we got a question that was submitted, and it reads, is there any benefit to quickly getting the requested materials to the examiners, or is it better to take some time and really be thorough with the response?
It's better to be thorough and right than quick. You can talk to the point of contact in the EIC and see what they're thinking, but this is how it typically goes. The EIC will get a first day letter to you or the supervisory staff, and they may or may not have anyone to work on that, what you're providing them, until the week before the exam. They'll freely tell you when they could work on something. So if they say, well, you know, I'm not going to be able to touch a lot of this stuff until 2 or 3 weeks from now, there's no point in hurrying it up. It's better to be thorough and accurate.
Thank you. Okay.
All right. In the past several years, there was, before I left the agency in 2015, there was a huge change in the way the FDIC fed, and since the most states use the FDIC program, how things were received. We used to go out, pick up boxes of stuff from the bank based on request letters, drive back to the field office and work on it. Well, as I'm sure you're all aware, the FDIC has gone paperless, and now they have a safe site shared with the various department heads in the bank where all the request information is electronically stored. It's called FDIC Connect. So everything, there's a memo that came out in late 2015 that went to the exam staff. They're mandated to be paperless. Literally, they're not supposed to be carrying paper into the bank or paper out of the bank. It's all to be electronically stored. So that has some of the older examiners, let's say, maybe like me, kind of raises some issues on how well to use the programs they give you and where to find things, which is what I kind of addressed earlier. They're still finding their way through this new exam program. I talked to some of them not too long ago, and they said it's getting better, but it's been a big adjustment. The point there says they've adopted ETS. That's a huge program, contains a lot of information. They spent a lot of money on it, and it took many years to send out, and people are still getting their arms around it. So if you're having some issues where people are asking you for the same thing over and over, it is possible that some people are not as educated in the program, in the storage of everything, as others. But that again, was a huge deployment. And even though it says it was deployed the second quarter of 2015, it was supposed to be deployed in 2013. So that kind of gives you an idea how well it went. As you know, new programs, even banking programs, sometimes are difficult to understand and become proficient in. Next slide. And I'll repeat, you only have one chance to make a good first impression. If you send back stuff that is sloppily constructed, missing items, I've even seen officer questionnaires come back handwritten with cross-outs, a myriad of things. you can't hardly think that the examiners are not going to get a bad impression of the bank before they even walk in the front door. So it's a good idea to make sure everything looks good, is exactly what they asked for, and is provided when they ask for it. Control of communication, that's critical in any exam in my mind. Track it as if you're tracking a closing of a credit. Date of first contact, date of first meeting, first day of the examination, and always try to get some idea of the last day on site. If nothing else, you'll know logistically when you can use the rooms again that the examiners are monopolizing. Another important thing is you've got to assign the right people with the right authority to get the information to the examiners. If you assign a low-level admin to get all this information and she's going to senior officers to get the information and they're busy, you may not be getting that information. You got to have the authority to get it, and this person looking at the request has got to understand what is being requested. And I might add, as part of the communication, if there's questions or documentation requests that the person does not understand and no one in the bank can really determine what they're asking for, call the EIC. That's what they're the point of contact for. They'll explain exactly what they're looking for. Again, as I said, documentation request list. To ensure everything's being provided, when you get the request list, and I'm positive most banks do this now, but some still don't, is what is requested, who's got to provide it, when was it requested, and when was it provided, so that you know everything is being provided to the examiners. There's nothing worse as a former supervisor when I get a call from an EIC a week before the exam saying, I haven't gotten half of the request list yet. I don't know what's going on. I've contacted the banker, and then I have to get involved. That slows down the exam, it hinders the process, and it gives a bad impression for the bank. Some regulators will always have a first day meeting with the bank president. Either they'll present the exam letter that we're having an exam, or shortly after you receive the exam letter, they'll want an impromptu meeting. If logistically the field office is too far from the bank, a lot of times that could be done by phone, but at least it's a little meet and greet to kind of get things rolling. That's probably a good idea. You should provide bank personnel contact to the EIC on what items should be requested from who. So that would help the process immensely. This person could get your loan request, this person could get your earnings request, et cetera, et cetera. As soon as possible, request an examiner name and responsibility list so you know which examiner is doing what on the exam. That's particularly important given the topic of the junior examiners. Many of you have had the same exam crews over and over, so you're familiar with the people on the exam crews. But if it's an out-of-town or out-of-area exam team, or it's names you don't recognize, you need to know that pretty quickly. And I can't stress this enough. Banks should set the tone for what happens in communication with the examiners. Start the exam, during the exam, and at the end of the exam. I think a good best practice is, let's have a meeting, maybe not the first week, but we want a progress report on the exam every Friday afternoon before you leave, just so we know what you're finding, because a lot of times exam teams will get onto something and they'll think it's a real issue and they'll pursue it when it could be diffused early if they're just not getting the right information or they're not understanding the context of the information. So I think a best practice is set up meetings with the senior examiners, the EIC, and any heads of their exam teams, so every Friday you'll know if they're finding things. Anything serious, anything I could get you, are you getting everything? Is there any finding that we need to discuss now? Another best practice that I've seen some banks do is the first day of the full exam is they will have, for lack of a better term, this is a regulatory intra-term, is a dog and pony show. Introduce your department heads, have a PowerPoint of where the bank's going, very similar to a condensed board meeting PowerPoint, just so the regulators meet, know who they got to talk to, they recognize, introduce each other to where they're going to be working, and they have a good feeling for the bank knows where they are and knows where they're going. Next slide. Just to give you a background on how exams are scheduled, it's statutorily, risk management exams are statutorily required. So depending on the size of the bank and the rating of the bank, you're going to happen every 12 to 18 months from the conclusion of the prior exam, which is the mail date or transmittal date of that examination. So if you're curious when your next exam is going to be, you can kind of plan. The maximum would be 12 or 18 months, depending on the bank's size and rating. So you might want to put that on a calendar somewhere or a planning pad so you know what's going on. One thing you'll know is every regulator has to swear in blood at the end of the year they're not going to miss any of those dates. So if your date comes out to December 28th, you're going to get examined with a date December 28th or earlier. I know everybody hates being examined at year end, but everybody's got to be somewhere, was my usually comment.
And Al, this is Scott. If I could just ask you to clarify, and especially given your perspective as a supervisor in Michigan, is this why on occasion an exam might start with one person or two people instead of the full complement?
Scott, you're telling all the secrets. Frequently, when you got backed up on exams, for example, Michigan, when you might suspect Michigan had some problems some years ago, there was no way we could examine all the banks we were required to examine with the staff we had. So the classic exam start date is the first date that the EIC puts its flag in at the boardroom table. So yes, frequently we'd have 4 exams started the last week of the year, one person each, and then we would come back and finish it up. That way we're still statutorily correct, and we didn't get fired. That never happens now, I'm sure.
Thanks, Al.
There's so many software programs that are used by the various regulators to determine exam scheduling, staffing, hours. FDIC uses something internally called FOMIS, which is Field Office Management Information System, and it will track hours, any comments that come in prior to exam hours, and it gives you an idea how many hours you can plan for the next exam. That's just the background stuff. Probably a lot of you don't really care to hear all the minutia, but that's how your exam's staffed. The supervisor will look at the hours it took the last couple of times, look at the bank's growth, review correspondence to see if there's any new things the bank is doing, and that's how they set the hours for their EIC to meet. And they measure that's carefully measured by supervisors, and the EIC is graded on how close they come to those hours. If you have an EIC that's consistently over hours but has not found any new serious problems, that would affect their performance evaluation. So whether you think that's important or not, that's important to the regulators for efficiency purposes. Also, the regulator tries to match up the bank's complexity with the EIC. That doesn't work every single time, but if you have a problem or a large bank, like a more senior examiner in charge of it. And again, typically you should get at least 30 days notice. When I was a supervisor, we tried to get it 45 days, but note the FDIC manual of exams says 14 days. So there could be short-staffed or short-time exam notices. Now, if you get an exam letter contacted, and it's going to be an impossible date for whatever reason feel free to contact the supervisor of that territory and say, is there any way you can change this exam date for me? Now, if you're coming up to your maximum exam date, they will not do that. But if there's an exam they can move forward on another bank and yours back, they'll try to do that. I've moved many exams. For example, while we're having a board retreat, the president's going to be out of the office for most of the exam. Someone's having an operation. We're not going to be able to talk to you on this. If I heard that thing, if something like that came up, I would look at the date, how much flexibility I had. I'd look at the other exams that I had scheduled farther on and see if I could switch banks. So if that happens, don't hesitate to contact the supervisor and say, is there any way we can work around this? Because if it's possible, they'll do it. Also, you should know, once the EIC is introduced, each field supervisor might have up to 10, 15 exams going at once. So once they get the EIC in plane to do your job, typically the point of contact is the EIC. They can't, the supervisor will not be intimately aware of the pre-exam or exam process of 15 different exams. If you're having an issue during the exam and it's becoming significant, again, do not hesitate to contact the supervisor. But if you can straighten it out with the EIC, that would be most helpful. Next slide. Okay, when you get this package of information requests, they want to know everything about your directors, your officers, everybody in the bank, blood type. No, I guess they don't ask that. But at any rate, they want to know a lot of things about you. I always wondered why they wouldn't ask about the EIC. If you're not familiar with the EIC, call the supervisor and go, hey, John Doe, I'm not familiar with him. Is he from your office? How long has he been on? How many exams? Et cetera, et cetera. They should not feel that that is an intrusion on them. They're asking you for everything. You should get something from them. Scott brought up earlier, is this a training job? If you've ever been subject to a training job, you'll know there's a lot more examiners there. They all typically look a little younger than some of us, and they're asking a lot of questions. You should know if it's a training job because you know it's going to take longer. You know there's going to be more people, and you should, as I used to tell bankers, consider it an honor. We would only try to pick the cleanest, best managed, most organized banks for training jobs if we could get away with it, so that the newer people would understand how a bank was supposed to be run. That is typically what we would try to do. And if it's an exam, it's a training exam for the EIC, that should be told to you up front, because at least in the FDIC, the Fed Reserve, and the OCC, until you become a commissioned examiner, you can't sign an exam report. So you might be talking to someone that you think's the EIC, and the exam comes back signed by someone else. Well, they should have told you that early on, that I'm the oversight examiner, I will be signing the exam report, but he or she is doing all the things as if she's the EIC. Again, it's important to know your exam team's level of experience. In particular, if it's an out-of-area crew, what's their experience and how much do they know about the area? Nothing worse than having a city crew do an agricultural bank, or maybe an agricultural crew doing a city bank, because they're going to have some issues. It's going to take longer. You might have to explain how different lending types work. Back in the prior debacle economy in the late 2008, 9, for example, Michigan, we were importing crews from wherever we could get them. Iowa, New York, Boston, and I always would call the banker and say, hey, this is going to be an out-of-state crew. This is how it's going to work. If you're having any issues, you can contact me, but know that you're going to have an out-of-state crew. Fourth point on this page is very important. See if you can nail them down on an on-site completion date. It won't be exact, but 3, 4, 5 weeks, because if they say they're going to be there for 4 weeks and you see them busily typing the 8th week, you have issues. Exams, generally, they know how long they're going to last unless they find something serious. Now, hopefully, through the communication process you set up with the weekly meetings, you would know that. But if suddenly you realize, hey, they've been there at least 4 weeks longer than I thought, there's a reason for that. You need to know that. Scott went through a lot of the current focal points of different agencies, what people are looking at. Know this about regulators. When there was asset problems, that's what we focused on because that would close the bank. 2006 to 2012, we didn't pay as much attention to BSA, to IT, to trust, those other things. Had limited hours, we were hitting big issues. So what happens when the banks clean up? We focus on the issues we left behind. So then you have bankers going, well, you didn't tell us we had all these problems in these areas 4 years ago. Well, 4 years ago, we were wondering if you were going to fail. So that's why after there's a crisis, these other areas start becoming more focal because the old adage, you go into the swamp, you didn't realize your goal was to empty the swamp when you're up high in alligators. I cleaned that up. I almost caught myself there. But at any rate, know the current focal point of your agency. And the last point, if you've been at your bank and you were at the prior exam and there was a lot of issues like surprises or there was problems, know what those were, document any problems you have at any exam so you'll remember them for the next exam. You might even want to discuss with the regulators. Hey, we had this issue there. We had this issue there. We just want to make sure we get in front of this so it doesn't happen again because it causes both of us a lot of trouble that was not necessary. Communication is the key, again. Last slide, again, I wanted to focus on this. Early identification, communication. I've been on exams where we thought the bank was really going downhill because we got the impression from the information given us that there was a real problem here, so we went down this road. If we had talked to the banker about it early on, it might have been diffused and we wouldn't have spent all this time going down a dead end. So again, best practice. Hey, at Friday afternoons, we just want to see where you're at, rough feeling of what you're finding, any critical findings, violations, classifications. Please let us know early on. Technical exceptions, are you seeing a lot of documentation exceptions on our loan in a particular area? We might be storing them somewhere that you're not aware of. Again, communication is important. The slide 20. There's always, I shouldn't say always, sometimes there's an examiner on a crew, and I know there's a kind of a grapevine of information. There's a prickly examiner on a crew or someone that may blow things out of proportion until things get controlled. You might want to be aware if you've hit that person before, if they're going to be on that exam and what they're in charge of, so you can ensure that you're aware of any of their findings and that you could kind of best manage that situation.
So Al, I think these were all great points. These are a little bit of inside baseball that I think it's always helpful for the bankers on this webinar to hear. We're going to turn it over to Steve Musso and Scott Martirana in a moment, but before we do, Pat, are there any thoughts or comments that either you want to add to?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the communication that Al was talking about because I think that's a communication that really should happen even before the examination. It's really in the banker's best interest to establish regular communication channels with the folks responsible for their bank so they can talk to those people, let them know what's going on in the bank, but more importantly, pick their brains about what are the issues that the examiners are focusing on. So it's well worth the time invested to do that on a regular basis so that when the exam comes, you're already sort of prepped on what areas the examiners might be looking at. So I just can't overemphasize that idea about if the more communication you have with the folks responsible for your bank, the better off you're going to be to establish those lines of communications and sort of a trust. There's a trust that gets built between the banker and the examiner that leads to a free flow of information and gets you better prepared for when the examiners actually come into the bank.
That's an excellent point, Pat, and you brought something to my mind. In between the exams, you have the contact information for your local supervisor. If something happens that is going to affect your call report or the management of your bank that's significant, call your regulator. No one likes to be surprised, and I promise you, every single call report is reviewed once they're available by every single supervisor. And if they know their banks, they'll know something that's wrong, and they'll call you. It's better that they already know something has happened than to be surprised on quarter end.
Thank you, guys. That's great insights. Appreciate you both taking the time to join the call. We're going to turn the webinar over to Steve and to Scott just for 5 minutes or so. Some very important action happened yesterday, and we want to be sure that we address it. So, gentlemen?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. This is Scott Martirena. Just a few minutes here, Tom. Steve and I are just going to hit a couple points. It definitely dovetails in with the regulatory topic we're talking about today. The regulators are focused on certainly interest rate risk, and so yesterday the Fed moved their target rate upward 25 basis points, their fourth movement since the beginning of the tightening period began. And I think in some ways the regulators are even more concerned about liquidity as the Fed may start unwinding its $4.5 trillion balance sheet and pulling some of that money out of the marketplace. And so we just wanted to spend a quick minute or two on some things that everybody on the webinar needs to think about. The first one of which is beta values on their deposit rates, and the fact that during the first three, we really didn't see any movement in non-maturity account offering rates, and I don't think we'll see a lot of movement off of this fourth one. And so really we've had a full 1% move in the Fed funds and in short and intermediate term market interest rates, but we haven't seen any movement on deposit offering rates. So, even though people were modeling in betas in terms of how much they thought their core deposit rates were going to move during that first 1% rate movement, the reality is rates really haven't moved on deposit offering rates. But I think that makes us more susceptible to the next few rate movements and likely higher beta values on these next rate movements. And Steve's going to take over in a second. I implore everyone on the phone to really have strategic discussions. And I know all of us here, client managers are reaching out to our recurring, ALCO and partner clients regarding beta values and deposit strategies and what you're going to do. You can't wait for next month, next year. You need to plan now so that you're ready to pull the trigger, because deposit competition is heating up.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So let me just raise an idea that I've kind of labeled for myself the core deposit fault line. So as Scott said, we've seen Fed funds move up 1%, 4 25-point moves, 3 in the last 3 quarters. So we've had a steady level of increases here. What's happened, though, is effectively, if I asked you all, you'd say we haven't raised our deposits at all. So that means that you've had a beta of 0. So you're still probably anywhere from 5 to 15 or 20 points to maybe as high as 35 points on your non-time accounts, your interest-bearing checking, your savings, your money market. Fed funds is up overnight at 132 right now. So the cheapest you can borrow right now is 132 if you need funding. And if you're going to try and do brokered or something like that, you're going to be around the same range. So there's this huge mismatch between what you're paying on your deposits and where the market is right now in terms of alternate funding. If we look at borrowings, we look at brokered, for example. If I go to the last rate fall, so from June of 06 to December of 08, market rates came down 5%. It was a steady fall. Over that time, the money market beta was, for national money market, 63 points. So that means for every 1% drop in rates, Fed funds, Money market rates from banks came down 63 points. That's a pretty big move. That means over 5%, they came down 315. Let's assume we normalize back up now the same way. Your beta so far is 0. You've got a lot of catching up to do. So that's the fault line to me. How far can rates move before it breaks? We have to start thinking strategically about how we're going to address this issue. One of the biggest challenges we're facing right now, many of our clients at least, is deposit growth. We're finding loans are out there, but deposits are hard to get. We're back to pre-2008 type of strategies where that's how we always planned. It was always tougher to grow deposits than it was to grow loans. We're all holding back our deposits. It's saving us some money right now, our deposit rates, but we're missing an opportunity, I think. Anything we can go out and steal under 132 is cheaper than borrowing. That's an opportunity for us. I think we can go out at 1 and 110 on a properly tiered and set up new money only type of savings or money market account and steal a lot of money right now, and we can do it cheaper than we can do it by doing overnight borrowing or some other source. And is it hot money? Potentially, but if rates come back down, we can adjust our tiers down and lower the account down or the rate on those accounts. And if it moves up, then we're already priced under. If it stays where it is, we're still funding cheaper than we can fund anywhere else. So I would encourage you, we're doing this with our ALCO clients. We're starting to talk strategically about pricing strategies and product strategies, but you should all be thinking about this. Betas are going to have to move up if Fed funds keeps going up. If it doesn't go up, there's an opportunity to get a lot of money in the door right now. So I think we should be considering that on the Fed funds side and our deposit pricing.
So just one other thing then, we just wanted to spend a couple minutes on rates and liquidity and what we see on the deposit side of things. For everyone on the phone, clients, non-clients, whatnot, November 2nd is our annual conference here in New Jersey. We usually have a huge turnout, but make sure you mark that date now. I know save the date emails and mailings and all kinds of things went out, but sometimes they get caught in spam filters, so make sure you mark the date now. November 2nd, typically will run all morning into the early afternoon here in New Jersey, so make sure you mark your calendar now. More information will be coming out on it over the summer.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Scott. I'm going to turn it back over to Bob Musso, who's going to offer some closing thoughts.
All right, so thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar. This will be posted within the next 24 hours, both the recording and the webinar itself, the document itself, onto the hub that you are all familiar with and have been going to get the webinars. Anyone who has not gone and accessed that before, please get in contact with us. We'll make sure you are set up correctly. Again, a copy of the webinar is also available in the handout section right now. You can go and download from there if you would like to. Again, anyone who wants CPE credits, please put in the phrase pre-exam 101 and your name within the question box down in the lower right, and we'll make sure that you get those CPE credits. And our next webinar is the quarterly economic and interest rate outlook webinar for quarter 3. That's happening on July 6th. If you are not registered yet or not planning on attending, we ask that you please do. It's going to be very important, especially because a lot of things that Steve and Scott just talked about and some of the uncertainty going on down in Washington will be discussed during it. So thank you all again for attending, and enjoy your day.